Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I am Napasha. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you, Esoteric, for allowing me once again to be on and to sit down and pick the brain of some of the most amazing scholars and historians and philosophers out there in modern day today. And with that said, we have Edward Dodge with us again. And today we're going to have the privilege of speaking to Mr. Dodge about his book, A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. This is going to be very exciting for me because in my research, I found that the mother goddess or the woman, is the first god, not only in what we say pagan religion, but also I'm seeing it in the Abrahamic religion, specifically Torah. So with all that said, that was loaded, but this is great to hand it over to Ed. I'm so glad to be with you again today to talk about this wonderful, very controversial topic. How are you?
Hey, Napod, it's great to be here, and thank you, Esoteric. It's always great to be on this show. Love you guys. So yeah, it's great to be here. As I've said before, my work has been focused on Asherah, the Israelite mother goddess in the Old Testament, and trying to uncover what was really going on there, because the one thing we can say for sure is they're getting rid of her. They're knocking her out, kicking her out, knocking her down. And I've been wanting to understand why ever since I first learned about her character, and that the scholars think that she's the wife of God, or used to be the wife of God.
Right.
I was just, I've been falling down this rabbit hole ever since for a couple of years now. And it's, I continue to be a bit flabbergasted by what I discover. And I'm equally flabbergasted that the academic scholars don't seem to find it all that interesting, because I think it's incredibly interesting. They all seem to say, yeah, there she was, and there she goes. And, they don't really focus on it all that much. But I think it's a really important topic. And I think it really speaks to, there's a lot of lessons we can take from it that modern day feminists, any modern day, woman who seeks to smash the patriarchy, I think there's a lot of lessons about how the patriarchy first came into being. We're taught that patriarchy goes back forever, that men have been dominating women since caveman times, smashing them over the head with a club and taking them away to have their way with them. And that's just the way it is, that men are strong and violent and women are weak and passive. And so it is, such is life. It's been like that forever. I totally don't think that's true. And the more I study the history, the less I think it's true. I actually think that there's pretty clear evidence that women had equal rights to men. It's not to say they were the same as men, but they had independence and authority of their own. The men had independence and authority over certain aspects of life. Women had independence and authority over other aspects of life, different, and they came together to create a complete society. And I don't think that men dominated women until basically the Bronze Age, and basically the beginning of what we call civilization, which is only 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BC or so, a little bit before that, but for the sake of argument, call it 3000 BC in Mesopotamia. And what we see at that time period is they call it the Bronze Age because it was a technology revolution. This is when we shift from Neolithic settlements. So we'd had the Neolithic revolution 6,000 years before that. And that's when we start having agriculture and start creating towns, because all in the Ice Age was all hunter-gatherers, right? I think everybody accepts that people were nomadic. They weren't settled. There's no evidence of settlements for, 200,000 years of human history. And then we get settlements with the beginning of agriculture, and then we get civilization. And at that point with civilization that we start to see kings and armies and warfare and slavery. And I think that the technology revolution is a big part of that, because it allows a small number of men with weapons, because this gives us the invention of weapons. It does two things. Bronze gives us a couple things. It changes agriculture from planting that was mainly done by women. It's something women would do close to home with children in tow, to farming. You now have plows and shovels and pickaxes. And this is something that requires stronger men, and specifically beasts of burden to do plowing. That's men's work. That's not women's work. That's not something women are doing with children around. It's something men are doing farther away from home on bigger fields with these big animals. That requires men. And so it starts to shift the balance of power in society, or just the balance of labor. You know, it really, it's not necessarily balance of power, but it shifts the nature of work and the nature of labor. Also, it introduces weapons. It introduces swords and daggers and armor. And now you've got a small number of violent men, ruthless men that have weapons, can come in and murder a bunch of people, take their stuff, kill all the men, and force the women into slavery. And the first slaves were all women for a long time. For maybe the first 1,000 years of slavery, they didn't enslave the men because they had no means to control them, and they didn't really have anything for them to do. So they would kill all the men and they would enslave the women. And then either impregnate the women or threaten their children. And so the women would then do whatever it took to protect their offspring. And so the women, who are naturally weaker, of course, physically, they would submit to protect their children. And then once they get impregnated, then they're definitely going to, you know, be more docile, right? This is just the nature of biology. And so for the first, I'm not sure exactly how many centuries it was, but it was a long time, maybe 1,000 years before they started enslaving men. So for the beginning, slavery was all just women. And so this is the beginning of like women's subjugation, and women, you know, men start forcing women into, you know, these subordinate roles. But it's not everywhere all at once. It happens slowly, and it happens progressively over time. And so I've got a theory that I'm sort of developing. I don't really talk about this in the first book. I'm developing it now. So I've developed this theory, and then I discovered, I'm going to mention this book first. This is called The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. And I just came across this book relatively recently. And this is a very famous book. She is a very famous and highly regarded feminist historian. And so the Bible scholars don't talk about this book, but the feminist scholars know it well. And it is, it's a classic. It's like her magnum opus. She's dead now, but she didn't die that long ago, I don't think. And this book is like I think it's from the 80s. And it is an absolute classic. And so I was a little nervous when I came across this book, because I was like, oh man, I bet she's probably going to show that I'm like wrong on everything. But actually, she's hitting all the same beats and stories that I was hitting. And I was really very relieved because like I was able to like shed some of my sort of spurious ideas and really focus in on what the stuff that's been academically accepted. That she's the one who I learned about slavery starting with women, that from her book. I never knew that before. And it kind of makes sense. You know, they had to literally invent chains at a certain point in time. You know, chains did not exist. Chains and shackles did not exist prior to the Bronze Age. You can only get so far trying to tie someone up with ropes. People are going to escape from their ropes. It takes chains and shackles to really keep a strong man down. Well, they didn't exist prior to the Bronze Age. At some point, some clever blacksmith had to invent chains, right? And so I learned this from her. And so there's a couple things that about how women had equal rights, and there's mechanisms to both women's independence and vice versa, women's subordination. And she makes this point, and we can see this in modern day indigenous cultures, that one of the key things is matrilineal bloodlines versus patrilineal bloodlines. When most indigenous cultures, and we see this in the colonial era when they were first starting to interact with, when the Europeans were first starting to interact with Native Americans or with the South Pacific Islanders, they all remarked at how free the women were and how free their sexual lives were and how they weren't being kept subjugated to the men. Native Americans don't subjugate their women. And one of the key things is they track their families through the mothers, not through the fathers. And when you track your families through the mothers, you don't have to control the women's sex lives. But when you start tracking the families through the fathers, now controlling women's sex lives becomes very, very important. The girls have got to be virgins before they get married. The women have got to be monogamous while they're married. Meanwhile, the men can go screw around as much as they want. No one cares about the men's sex lives. because you're controlling for paternity. You only care about controlling the women's sex lives. And even if they say they're trying to tell men not to screw around, the truth of the matter is they never have really controlled men's sex lives. It's something that happens in Christianity later on, that they start telling the men to behave themselves. But all through the Roman pagan era, the Greeks and Romans, the men were free to do whatever they wanted sexually, and the women were not. And they were very patriarchal cultures. But when you go back farther in time, back to the Sumerians and the Mesopotamian cultures. So this is my thesis here, is in the 3rd millennium BC, the 2000s, it's the Sumerians. And you see that the women had very free sexual lives. In the 2nd millennium, we've shifted from the Sumerians to the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And they speak the Akkadian language. So I'm going to call them all the Akkadians. So Sumerian language, 3rd millennium, Akkadian, 2nd millennium. And then the 1st millennium BC is going to be the Greeks and Hebrews. And with each progressive era, we see the patriarchy asserting itself more and more, and we see themselves shutting down on the women's sex lives. And so I was wondering about this whole notion of matriarchy and patriarchy and matrilineal and patrilineal. And it turns out to be totally true that the Sumerians have far more matrilineal bloodlines, and that gets progressively shut down as we go forward in time. And when you get to the Hebrews, they make a really big deal about patriarchy, and they go on and on and on in the Bible about patriarchal bloodlines, and they track them all the way back to Adam. And this is a very important point for the Hebrews. It's got to be patriarchy. It's got to be patrilineal bloodlines. And we take it for granted in Western culture ever since that that's just the way it is and the way it's got to be. And then they were all shocked when they met the Native Americans and found that they didn't do it that way. Well, it goes hand in hand, that women's independence and the structure of our families goes together. There's another aspect to it, which is how marriages are structured entirely. And this is what they call a matrilocal marriage versus a patrilocal marriage. And we see examples of this in the Bible. A matrilocal marriage is where the man goes and lives with the woman's family. And a patrilocal marriage is where the woman goes and lives with the man's family. And this goes hand in hand with matrilineal and patrilineal bloodlines. And so if it's a matrilineal family, the man's going to go live with the woman's family. And these are mostly tribal clans where the women all stay together. The women never leave home. The women have always stuck together with their mothers and their sisters and their aunts and their cousins and their nieces. And the women have all stick together. They never leave. They never leave their family. They never leave their inherited wealth. And the women all stick together to share the childcare duties and share all this stuff. And part of this is that these types of marriages, they call them visiting marriages. The men would kind of come and go. They'd kind of stick around for a while, but then they might go back to their family. And if the woman didn't like the man, divorces were very easily granted, and they would just kick the guy out, and he just wouldn't come back. Meanwhile, the women never left. Now, the flip side of that, a patrilineal marriage where the woman goes and lives with the man's family. Well, now if it's an unhappy marriage, or he's an abusive husband, or if he's an unproductive, not a good provider, now the woman's got, a couple, 3 children. She's totally stuck. She is totally dependent on that man. And if it's an unhappy or abusive marriage, she is totally stuck. And we see that all the way to the modern day, right? She's been taken away from her family. She's been taken away from her sisters and her cousins and her aunts and nieces. And she is totally reliant on this man's family for her entire life. And if the man kicks her out, man, she's totally screwed, right? She's totally screwed. And this is like such is life for how women are in the modern day, right? Until leaving the 20th century out of it, this is how it's been for women all along. What you see, though, in Sumerian culture in particular, is that they still had these matrilineal marriages going. And they still had, and then the Akkadians come along, and they were more violent, they were more patriarchal. And so they were asserting patriarchy more and more, and they wanted more of these patriarchal marriages. And it comes from top down. It comes from kings deciding that they don't want to leave their inheritance to their daughters. They want to leave their inheritance to their son. So the ruling classes start to impose these patrilineal family structures, and that comes top down and filters into society. So I've got a theory about, and this is kind of one of the things I'm trying to explore and get more evidence for, is that when they talk about farmers versus shepherds in the Bible and in Mesopotamian literature, that so farmers and shepherds being Cain and Abel. Cain is the devious, untrustworthy farmer who murders the virtuous shepherd Abel. And everyone's always wondering, what was wrong with Cain? Cain is a farmer. He makes offerings of vegetables to God and they're rejected. And no one really seems to know why. They're like, people have different theories about it, that Cain, he didn't have enough, they weren't his best fruits, or he didn't have enough heart, and he wasn't genuine or whatever. But like, the simple truth is that the whole story is only about 400 words and they don't elaborate on it. It's a very short story. The whole story is one page. So there's no elaboration as to what Cain had ever done wrong, why his offerings were rejected. Well, this is a story written by shepherds to disparage farmers, because all the way through Mesopotamian history and the Hebrews is that they were shepherd kings. And shepherd kings is something they talk about a lot in Mesopotamian history. All the kings are always shepherds. They don't wear a crown, they wear a shepherd's cap. And obviously, the Hebrew stories are all written from the perspective of shepherds. Abraham is a nomadic shepherding family, and all the good kings are always shepherds. And shepherd is a metaphor, a symbol that they use for honor and goodness, and it plays right on through into Christianity and everything. Well, my theory is that farmers and shepherds aren't just like two different vocations. We're not talking about carpenters and bricklayers here. We're talking about two different classes of people. The shepherds being the militant, patriarchal ruling class, and the farmers are the poor, peasant, indigenous. They're the peasant farmers, basically. They're the indigenous peasant farmers. And they're the ones with these older, matriarchal, matrilineal cultures. And the shepherds are, the more militant ruling classes who dominate them. And they start imposing their values on the shepherds, on the farmers. But it takes like 2,000 years for it all the way to play out. And that when we're still seeing it in the Old Testament, that when the Hebrew prophets are being very critical of all the Canaanites' sex lives and of all this stuff that they're doing, I think that what they're doing is they're criticizing the peasant class. All scholars have always recognized that the biblical writers are the ruling class, that they're in with the kings, and that these prophets are all, they're a ruling class. They're not the poor people. And we don't get any literature from poor people. We only get literature from ruling class. Yeah, all right.
Wonderful. Okay, so with that thought in mind, and this is wonderful. This information is very, very important for us to take a hold of and do your research, confirm what he's saying, especially the part about women being the first slaves. That's poignant. It hits home. It's sad, but it's also very, it opens up a lot of different doors and it makes a lot of sense. But anyway, I digress. That's not what I wanted to say when I said may jump in. When you talk about these farmers versus the shepherds, are both of these classes of people, or both of these types of these groups of people, these societies, are both of them doing the same with women though? That's what I'd like to know. Was there one group that was better with women, or they didn't have slaves, or was it just universal for, even despite the enemies and the opposition, we all still understand the woman is down? I wanted you to talk on that for us. And
yeah, so my theory on it is that they're living in the same towns. These people, they know each other, they interact with one another, but they are like different social classes. So I think that, so it's kind of like white and black folks in America, like, especially during slavery days, they got very intimate relationships with one another. They can be living in the same households, but they're living on, culturally speaking, they might as well be living on different planets. Like black people and white people in slavery days, they're literally in the same house, but their worldview and their lived experiences are, universes apart from one another, right? And I think that's I think that's the same kind of thing, analogous to what we're seeing here, a ruling class and a poor peasant class. You look at class society in America or in Europe in the Middle Ages, the kings and the royalty are living behind the walls of the castle, and they're having one kind of experience. Meanwhile, the peasant farmers who are poor, they don't have slaves. They're just trying not to become slaves. But you have to be rich to own slaves. Poor people don't own slaves. And poor people, generally speaking, women have more rights than rich people because, frankly, the poor man has very little capacity to boss his poor, when everybody's poor, the poor man has very little capacity to boss the woman around. So women have much more in poorer cultures, generally speaking, women, poor women have a lot more latitude relative to their poor husband. But as you go up the social classes and wealth, the men have more power, but also they kind of buy off the women because the rich women they give up their sexual freedom, but they're given slaves and hand servants and wealth and all this stuff. So there's this grand bargain for the women, for the upper class women. So the upper class women buy into it one way, whether they do it, by whether they like it or not, they end up buying into their social strata and they get benefits from it. But the poor women, they have a lot more freedom, and also they're not respected. So no one really cares what they're doing. Right. So if you're not giving up your respect, your social status, whereas rich women have a lot of social status to protect. They can't go around being slutty, like they can't exercise sexual freedom because they have got a lot to lose. Whereas poor women, who cares? Like, it's like they're doing whatever. So there's that. So I do think the farmers and
Can you
shepherds
give
are
us,
totally
Ed,
interacting.
I want to jump in. Can you give us some examples of that in like an ancient society, an ancient civilization where the women, like maybe, I'm going to kind of help out here. When women were temple prostitutes, would that fit into what you're talking about?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I've
Could you talk
got
about
some quotes. So I didn't really prepare this as a lecture, so I'm just kind of like talking. So like, but I do have some quotes here from Mesopotamia about exactly this stuff and about the sexuality in particular and about how they use farming metaphors for sex all the time. Plow my vulva is like something that Ishtar says. So one thing I want to point out is, before I get into the quotes, is that the most popular goddess of the Bronze Age was Inanna, and then Ishtar, and then she becomes Astarte. She's a prostitute. And she is extremely, extremely sexual. And this is one of the things that shifts as in the first millennium when they throw out these old religions, the Greek and Roman religions. The high goddess is by no means a prostitute, and she is not putting her sex on wild display. Whereas Ishtar is extremely sexual, and her myths and liturgies are like pornography by our standards. I mean, like, you wouldn't even in the 1950s, like you'd be censored to read the stuff I'm going to read to you right now that are about Ishtar. These are very, very sexual societies. And now there's a lot of controversy about the nature of prostitution and the nature of sexual priestesses. And I want to be clear on this. We don't have evidence of them saying, go up on the altar and copulate. Like, there's nothing that says like explicit sex rituals. And so this stuff gets controversial because Christian scholars for centuries have always called these women temple harlots, right? And the modern scholars are pushing back on that and saying, we don't really have good evidence of any sex in the temples. Well, I'm going to push back on that a little bit because we know that Inanna is a Sumerian version. She's the goddess of love and war. She's the queen of heaven. She's the most popular goddess in ancient Sumer. She shifts in Akkadian language. She becomes Ishtar, and she's still the most popular goddess, still the goddess of love and war. In the Bible, she's Astarte. In Greek and Roman religion, she's Aphrodite. But she's no longer the goddess of war or wisdom or any of this. She's just sex and beauty. So that, and all those powers are split off to Athena. So Ishtar is like Athena and Aphrodite combined into one super goddess. And so she has all the war powers, the wisdom, divination, all these great powers. And she's also never, she and the other goddesses as well, are never submissive to any male characters ever. Like there's not a single story where they're submissive. And I think that what is going on is that there was a culture of gift giving. So that there's a lot of sex going on, but it's not prostitution in the sense of a man purchasing a woman's body from a position of male dominance and women's degradation. That's prostitution in the modern world. But in the ancient world, I think they're having sex and men are giving the women gifts and the women are happily receiving these gifts, but it's not that sort of degraded purchase of her body. The woman has agency to say yes or no. It's like a woman in the modern world. She can have her lovers, and if her lovers wants to buy her expensive gifts, she's more than empowered to receive it. If he wants to buy her a car or buy her a house, I mean, this happens all the time. And a critic of that woman might call that girl a whore. That girl wouldn't consider herself a whore because she's just a woman having a lover who happened to be a rich guy who bought her an expensive gift. I think that's the kind of things that we're seeing in the ancient world, is that these women were simply independent and they had their independence, and they could pick whatever lovers they wanted. And if the lover wanted to give them a gifts, that's their choice. And so I think the term prostitution is, it's a very loaded term. Frankly, it's a patriarchal term. It's something that Gerda Lerner talks about, and a lot of modern day feminist scholars are talking about, that we should throw out the word prostitution when we're talking about these ancient women. That, yeah, they're having sex, and yes, there's gifts being exchanged, but it's not this quid pro quo purchase of her body, and it's not a degraded thing.
May I jump in and add something
Yeah.
to what you're saying? If we looked at the mother, the womb, and all that it represents, and we could get rid of all of the stereotypes and stigmas, and just look at the desire of, I mean, this is getting a little bit deep, but the desire for sex that throughout time, some people call it lust, but it's not as basic as lust. It's a great desire to be a part of that womb, that the vagina, the whole womb, the uterus, the whole womanly, that part of her. And not just on a physical level, it does affect, people spiritually. So if we looked at it, and maybe we could connect better and understand beyond prostitution, just the way it was looked at on in an unadulterated way in ancient times, right? Where it was worship in a sense, more than someone just throwing her body around. And it was not, sex with the woman was revered and not seen filthy. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Maybe
No, it was
people could
definitely not
relate to
seen
that
as
one.
filthy. It was, no, I think that the mother goddesses, going back to the Ice Age, because we have all this evidence that they were goddess worshippers with the Venus figurines coming all the way through. I don't want to digress into that whole subject, but like, we've got the Venus figurines for 30, 40,000 years all the way through. And so we know that they were putting women at the center of their cultural life. And, these people they were focused on the generation of life. Like, it's all about the generation of life. And it's the woman who is the source of life. And so that's why they put the women at the source of it. And I think that's the heart of mother goddess worship, and the connection of sex and fertility and motherhood with plants and nature is all about, it's all about the life and generating the life spirit. And I think that's really at the heart of it. And I do think that's the very center of it all, for sure.
Well,
But I
I'm
do.
I'm glad you put it that way. Thank you so much. So this is great. I
Well,
didn't
no,
want
I
to
mean,
stop
that's a
your
good
flow.
question, because
Yeah.
it's easy to digress into like the more like, I don't know, tawdry aspects of the sexuality, because it's pretty scintillating stuff, frankly. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
it
concrete
is.
to us now though, but back then it was
Oh,
divine.
actually, I don't know. I think they were pretty
I've
sexual
done my
too.
research.
Um,
Let's talk.
but
No, come on. Let's get some of it out if it's okay with esoteric. I
yeah,
mean, this
no,
is an
no,
adult
really, I
thing.
think that especially as you go back to ancient Sumer, they had sex in the streets was like something that they did,
Yeah,
public sex, and that they believed that having sex in the streets was a sign of like a healthy culture. Like if you go to a
right.
town and people are like literally screwing in the streets, that was a sign of a town that was vibrant and full of life and full of joy and full
But
of
you know that
pleasure.
happened also in that's not just at that far back as far as those civilizations. Luther, Martin Luther went to the Vatican to Rome, and he saw that. He's like, "What's going on here? Is this Caligula?" It wasn't Caligula, but yeah. So I definitely have read that. So, but you know what though? That's because of the way sex was looked at, and this is fascinating. I mean, maybe this could be your next book. What was sex, ancient sex compared to modern sex, is because of that heavy hand of patriarchy and control of the mother, that became where, oh, not, I'm not saying people should have sex in the street, but that
Me neither.
patriarchal control came in, and then sex is public sex was like an outrage. So
Yeah,
again,
it
don't
becomes
come for
really
me. I'm not
scandalous.
saying people should have sex in public. What?
No, no, no. In Roman era, it becomes really scandalous. Like
Yes.
the bacchanals, the Bacchus
Uh,
festivals,
yeah.
they start to outlaw it and execute the priests of Bacchus in the Roman era because they were so scandalized by these public sex
Right.
carnivals, basically.
Well, they
Um,
did need some control. We're talking about affecting children. I mean, there are children present, but in an adult setting, we've got a different idea of why are you looking at it as so evil that you have to stone someone to death, and that goes into the Abrahamic. But I'm not trying to go ahead of, because I'm loving what you're talking about. If you could get some of that literature,
all right, I've
maybe the
got one right
PhD.
here. This is one of my favorite ones. This is from the Akkadian time period, and it's about Ishtar. Um, and it's called Ishtar Will Not Tire, or Ishtar Does Not Get Tired. Um, and this one's a little bit unusual because it's got a refrain in it. Most of this old literature doesn't have like a poetic refrain, but this one does. So you'll get what I'm saying here. One comes up to her. The city is built on pleasure. Come here, give me what I want. The city is built on pleasure. Then another comes up to her. The city is built on pleasure. Come here, let me touch your vulva. The city is built on pleasure. Since I'm ready to give you all that you want, the city is built on pleasure. Get all the young men of your city together. The city is built on pleasure. Let's go to the shade of the wall. The city is built on pleasure. 7 for her midriff, 7 for her loins. The city is built on pleasure. 60, then 60, satisfy themselves in turn upon her nakedness. The city is built on pleasure. The young men have tired. Ishtar will not tire. The city is built on pleasure. Get on with it, fellows, for my lovely vulva. The city is built on pleasure. As the girl demanded, the city is built on pleasure. The young men have heeded. Give her what she asked for. The city is built on pleasure. And that's it.
Do you think that was very interesting? Thank you. And where is that particular excerpt from?
It's from Babylon, the time of Hammurabi. It's an Akkadian hymn.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
it's it's Akkadian literature.
Okay. Well, so do you now at the time of Hammurabi? I'm going to go out on a limb and say by this time, patriarchy has gotten a great hold of societies and civilization. Correct?
Yep,
Because I
yep.
do
And
hear some
well, let me go on to the
overtones
next
of
one.
patriarchy in that.
Um,
A bit of
let me go.
misogyny is creeping in.
um, 7
Not
for a
much,
midriff.
but
60 then 60
it reminds
satisfies
me of
themselves in
kind of like
turn.
rap, like the um the Miami Luke Skywalker, what were they called? Two Live Crew. Uh because
I
the
mean,
reason is, it's great that I love that you read that. It's that I hear she doesn't tire. She always wants sex. Now we're getting into the abuse of women, where but it's not completely blatant obvious. But then I hear more beside. I don't hear reverence. I hear she always wants it. She's got
I
to
mean,
have
it's
it.
definitely like a gangbang kind of scenario, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And there's an
yeah.
entire genre of pornography of like one woman with an entire crowd of men. And
Wow.
there's one my whole theory on men and women's sexuality is that men's sexual drive is like this and women's sexual drives is like this. That like
Hmm.
women, when they're really fired up, are way more sexual animals than men, but at the same time they can also completely shut it down for like years at a time, much more so than men. Men are much more consistent. It's a little up and down. Women are
Hmm.
like,
Right.
so when women are really fired up, they'll run the man right off the bed. um and so let me go on to this next one though, to get to what you were just talking about. Hold on, where did it go? All right, so this is from slightly later. It's Akkadian Councils of Wisdom, and this is talking to this is wisdom that a young man would be receiving, talking about women. And so there's these different class. The women have different names. This is one thing we know about them. The Harimtu woman is a free woman, and that is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so, do you know the character Shamhat, who goes out and meets Enkidu, the wild man, and has sex with him for 7 days and civilizes him? She's a harimtu. That's what the word that describes her. And she has traditionally been translated as a harlot. But the actual translation is that she's one of these women. So the harimtu was a designated class of women, legally protected, who lived in outside of patriarchal authorities. They had their own houses where they lived with their mothers, or they may even adopt girls off the street, and there's no man in the house. And the women were free. They didn't live under patriarchal authority, and it's a designated class of women with their own name called a harimtu. And this is this argument about why it's inappropriate to describe these women as prostitutes, because that's what the Christian scholarship has for centuries now has said. Oh, they're just a prostitute. She's just a prostitute, just a prostitute. No, she's like a modern day woman who is self-employed or whatever, has her own source of income. She's capable of providing for herself, or she and the rest of her, female family are capable of providing for themselves without men. They own taverns. There was lots of businesses that women had. Owning taverns was one of them. Weaving was another one. Weaving is not like just drudgery. Weaving is an industry. They make products and they sell those products and they keep the money. And it was women's business. Men didn't do weaving. Women do weaving, because that's the kind of thing you can do with children around. You can have your kids around your feet. You can stop and start whenever you want. There's no like danger for the kids. It's a perfect place to educate your children, teach them how to count, teach them how to do patterns, teach them how to be productive. It's a perfect place to have little kids running around and be able to like educate them while you're working. It's why it's a good women's industry. And there was other businesses that women ran, but taverns was a big one. They were medicine women, they were midwives. There was all sorts of industries that were women's businesses. And so these harimtu were these self-employed, independent women that were legally protected as a class, but that status gets lost. That gets taken away in time. But for the Sumerians, it was very much still around. And so basically my theory is, in the third millennium, there's loads of these women and loads of women's independence. Second millennium, they're starting to call it into question and they're starting to challenge it. And that's what I'm going to get into here. And then first millennium, they shut it down altogether and they just take away the women's independence completely. So then you've also got priestesses and a courtesan who is more of like an actual prostitute. And so this is from Akkadian Councils of Wisdom. It's circa 1500 BC. So this is smack in the middle of the second millennium when they're challenging these women, but they're still around. All right. So this says, I'll start it now. This is advice given to a young man. So I'll start it here. It says, do not marry a harimtu, one of these free women, whose husbands are legion, or an Ishtaritu, a priestess of Ishtar, who is dedicated to God, to a goddess, or a Kalmasitu, a courtesan who gives her favors to all. In your troubles, she will not support you. In your fights, she will sneer at you. She does not know respect and submission. Should she dominate your house, get rid of her, for she has directed her attention to another's footfall. And so if I'd had a chance to prepare slides, these would have all been on slides so you could read it yourself. So this is when they're starting to challenge these women. And you see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Ishtar tries to seduce Gilgamesh and he insults her instead. He doesn't submit to her seduction, and instead he insults her and she gets very angry about it. Yeah. But Gilgamesh gets away with it. He totally gets away with it. And Ishtar just has to sort of nurse her wound, so to speak.
But let me ask you, doesn't he tell her, I've seen how you use your men up and throw them away?
Yeah, because I think she probably did.
So he was protecting himself, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think, look, women can be nasty. Let's be honest. Women aren't all very nice all the time. And what? So
I can't believe you. No, I'm just saying, of course.
So, men can be nasty to women and women can be nasty to men. And a fully empowered woman who's free to take on whatever lovers and go on from one guy to the next, whoever gives her the best gifts. I'm sure there was women doing that. I have no doubt that there were women doing exactly that. And so, stereotypes exist for a reason, because there's always a certain measure of truth behind them. Even if they're insulting and degrading, there's always some kernel of truth behind them, or otherwise the stereotypes wouldn't stick. But this is a point. The point here of what I've just read is that, they're pointing out that these women exist, these free women exist, and they're telling these young men, stay away from these girls. These girls are bad news. And then you get into the biblical time period. Both the Greeks and the Hebrews shut this stuff down altogether. They're not letting these girls out the back at all. And we see it explicitly with like the prophet Hosea, the book of Hosea and Gomer. His marriage is exactly what they're describing in one of these. I don't know. I theorize that she's a priestess. I don't actually know that she's a priestess. I don't think it matters that she's a priestess. She could just be one of these independent women. But what I do think, Gomer's the wife of the prophet Hosea. I do think that she is representative of Canaanite women, and that she is symbolic of Canaanite women, largely of these farmer women, and of these peasant farmer women who don't submit and who are sexually independent. And it's exactly that they're shutting it down. We're not going to let you do that stuff anymore. Let's see. I've got one more here that I wanted to read. Let's see. Oh, this one's more of prostitution. This is a goddess. I forget her name. Let's see. The Sumerian goddess. All right. So this is Sumerian. This is older. Her name is Nanaya, and she kind of is a prostitute, or she is like selling her sex, but it's all farming metaphors. So this one's short. This is the last one I've got to read. It says, when I'm standing by the wall. All right. So keep in mind, there's no money in this time period. Everything is barter. Money doesn't get invented until 600 BC. There's no coined money until much later in history. 600 BC is when coins get invented. They had shekels of silver, but that was just a weight. It's not a coin. So like a coin that has like an imprint on it and there have different abstract values, that is an invention much later on. So in the earlier Mesopotamian history, everything is barter. So here it says, when I am standing by the wall, it is 1 lamb. When I am bowing down, it is 1.5 shekels. Don't go digging any other canal. I will be your canal. Don't go plowing any other field. I will be your field. Farmer, don't go looking for any other moist patch. I will be your moist patch. And that's it. And it's just, and the point is that it's all farming metaphors for sex, plowing and canals and moist patch. Like it's this association of sex and farming that I think is playing out when the shepherd kings are disparaging of the farmers all the way throughout the Old Testament. Adam and Eve get punished by becoming farmers. Cain is a farmer. and he goes, and his people go and form the first towns. Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed by, by the fire of God for their perverse sexual behavior. And it's always that the nomadic shepherds from outside the towns are looking at the people in the towns with all their licentious, promiscuous sexuality and saying, look how awful these people are. It's like all like Las Vegas, all over the place, and they're being very highly critical of it. I actually think there's some historical truth to it, that the towns were pretty promiscuous places, as I was pointing out before in the previous passage, and that these guys coming, certainly the Hebrew shepherding prophets from the outside the towns are very critical of it. So here's a little aside about Sodom and Gomorrah, and I want to dig into this one a little bit more in my research. Archaeologists have found evidence, and this is a bit of an aside here, I just want to make this point. They found evidence of a town, like in the same places where Sodom and Gomorrah are described, that was totally destroyed by an asteroid around 1700 BC. That an object from space totally blew this place to smithereens like a nuclear bomb. And they have found it, like that the burned layer of ash, and like it's all evidence of an extraterrestrial impact right in the same location as where Sodom and Gomorrah are described as being, right in the right time period, around 1700 BC. And I can only imagine, I'm totally speculating here, that maybe there really was a city that really was destroyed by an asteroid. And so then people are saying, as they will do, like, why were they destroyed by an asteroid? Well, because they must have displeased the gods. They were angered the gods somehow. Well, why did they anger the gods? Well, because they're a bunch of sexual perverts. That's why they angered the gods. So, I need to dig into that one a little bit more. That's some new archaeology, though. That's like brand new. In the last couple of years, they found this town that was totally demoed and totally obliterated by like a nuclear bomb of like being hit by an asteroid. So I just think that's funny.
That's interesting. I think I recall hearing something like that, but I can't fully I recollect vaguely. But I do want to ask you, this is great. I mean, we get to talk to you about the progression from mother goddess to whore, to sacred whore, to sacred prostitute, to what's going on today. Because you say from Ice Age, what about today, and how the modern, let's talk about the main religions, the Abrahamic religions, how they have completely cut out the mother and turned her into wisdom or the Holy Spirit. Can you discuss that with us for the ones who are out there?
Or the Virgin Mary being, the Protestants love to point out that the Virgin Mary is like, barely concealed pagan goddess. Well, they're right. She's got all the titles. The whole virgin birth story is one of the oldest religious tropes repeated over and over and over again. Ishtar and Inanna, they were called virgins. That's part of this paradox, is that these very sexual goddesses were called virgins, and so were their priestesses were called virgins, and they were called the holy ones or virgins. If you approach them in the street, you would say, oh, as a term of respect. And what virgin meant had nothing to do with chastity. It just meant an independent young woman who wasn't married or probably didn't have children. It didn't mean they'd never had sex before. And so the term virgin gets totally shifted to being a girl that's never had sex, whereas for the Sumerians and the Babylonians, that's not what the word meant. And these goddesses, whom they called the virgins, were definitely not chaste. They were extremely sexual. So that I think is very interesting. And virgin births and is like, goes back to the old mother goddess, where the primordial source of all creation was a mother who was alone, and she had to give birth to her own mate in order to procreate. And this is something you see in animals. Like I just saw of some monkey in a zoo somewhere, and she's been kept by herself for years, and she got pregnant. And they say genetically she is impregnated by the male chimp or whatever. I have to find this article in a neighboring
Yeah,
cage,
you're
but they're
gonna
like,
have to
they were
get that
never
one
actually
for
put
me.
together.
Wait. You're talking about a primate that,
Current, like this past
um,
week in the news,
wow.
in a
Wow,
zoo
that's a
somewhere in
little,
Asia.
oh boy. My
Um,
mind is racing.
so I think when under enough stress, women can impregnate themselves. I don't even think they certainly see it in lower animals. Like, um, I think it's very unusual to the highest degree in mammals, but I don't think it's completely unprecedented. Um, I'll have to dig that up, but that was a pretty
Yeah,
funny
sure.
story.
That's
But yeah,
interesting.
there's no question that, as in the Abrahamic faiths, all three of them, that they don't want independent women, and they don't want any of these kinds of mythologies of empowered, independent, non-submissive women. They have to be, the mythologies have to be eliminated in order to keep the women in line, because these stories give all the wrong ideas. Like, you can have your daughters reading stories about Ishtar, who challenges her father, who steals powers from the other gods, who never submits, who sends her own husband to hell. Like, these are not the stories of submissive women. And so you have to eliminate these stories at a cultural level if you want to keep your women in the dark. Same way when they brought Africans over as slaves, they did not teach them their own history. They told them, you have no history, because there weren't proud kings of Africa. They don't want the slaves knowing any of that stuff, right? Like, they kept them completely in the dark and completely ignorant of everything. Well, they did it to women first, and they set the model with women, and then applied it to other subjugated peoples later on. Um, um, and so, yeah, and the Virgin Mary, like, she's not a deity anymore. She has all the tropes, all the titles, the Queen of Heaven, but she's not a deity. Like, what's up with that? Of
Hmm.
course she's a deity. She's the mother of God. How could she not be a deity? But you don't want, in that culture, they don't want the women feeling empowered. Um, and even in the pagan parts of Europe, so Christianity in the Middle Ages was never 100% universal across Europe. There was still a certain amount of paganism going on in the hinterlands. There were parts of Europe that Christianity never completely took over, and even in those places, the most popular goddesses were like Diana, and she's chaste. She's not super sexual. And so even the goddesses that did stick around weren't celebrating women's promiscuity. They shift over to Dionysus around this same first millennium time period. When they're getting rid of Ishtar, the Greeks have Dionysus. He becomes, who's a gay male character. He becomes the source of all the promiscuous sex, and not the women so much. They really don't want, in that time period, they really don't want the women being the images of promiscuous sexuality.
Can I
Um,
ask you a question? When you talk about Dionysus, um, again, we know gay as homosexual, but at the time, not taking this away from the subject of women, because he had primarily a female following, right?
right. Yeah,
Why?
absolutely.
Where do we? Was he mimicking like the female, the everyone else's desire to be with the female? Because we do have also the temple prostitutes that were male. Can you talk a little bit about how that, I'm not talking about homosexual relationships, but on the level of worship, where they had the temple male prostitutes and how
Yeah. So
they mimicked women?
absolutely. Yeah. That's a part of it. They would castrate themselves in service of the mother goddess, and then they would dress in women's clothing and basically, present as women. Now we can get all this complicated verbiage of like transvestite, transgender, cross, like, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But the point is that these, just call them trans, were a big part of these traditions in Sumer and all the way through into the Bible. And you see them in the Bible and they're getting kicked out. The only times they're mentioned in the Bible is when they're being chased away. But that means that they were there. And so while they didn't talk about homosexuality in the ancient world, they were definitely keenly aware of being the passive recipient of anal sex was a emulation of being a woman. Like that, that was not lost on them. And that's why for the Greeks, it was perfectly fine for a masculine man to be given it, to be the top, I don't know what's the right terminology we should be using here.
Well, we can use the word pederasty was not just accepted, it was a man of high stature was expected to have a male, younger man as a lover. So
yeah, no, and the only lines that they draw was that the man not be penetrated. Like, if you're being penetrated, that was degrading for a masculine man. But you could do anything else. You could kiss, you could touch each other's genitals, you could touch each other's genitals with your hands and stuff, but you just couldn't be penetrated. So you could have orgasms, you could fool around, lay in the bed naked, do all that stuff, as long as you're not penetrating them. And a lot of these pederasty relationships, they were totally respectable. And so it would be like a family friend. It would be like a mentor for a younger man from another within your friendship groups. And as long as you weren't penetrating the boy, it was fine. But you could lay in bed and
we're specifically talking about Greek culture, everyone. We went away from the temple prostitutes and right.
Yeah, so that's the Greek thing. But the temple prostitutes, these men were getting penetrated. They definitely were definitely having anal sex and being the bottom in anal sex. And it was in emulation of women. And so these guys were not masculine men, obviously. These are men in service of the mother goddess. Whereas for the masculine man, it was perfectly fine to go and give it to that guy. It was good luck to go to the temple and give anal to the priest, which is a bit of a flip of the, Catholic sex, scandals, right?
You're laughing. The laughter is obviously.
I have to laugh.
I was going to say, and in your defense, you don't have to defend yourself. The irony is there that it's comical, but I wanted to let everyone know that this is very serious, and this isn't. It's taboo, but you see it. I believe in cycling, and you see these things now. And they cycle back from ancient times. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So
and I apologize. I deal with absurdity by laughing, I deal with horror sometimes by laughing, because we live in an absurd world. And if I'm not going to laugh, I'm going to cry about this stuff, because it's like it's kind of dramatic, emotional stuff, and I don't want to cry, so I laugh. And
that's fine. That's why I came in to defend you with the laughter, just because I know I've been on social media for a while. It is, listen, the irony, you have to find somewhere in you where you can just shake your head and laugh, because like I said, we want to be so disconnected from ancient times, but we can look right now in the Catholic Church and know this is I'm
certainly not laughing about that stuff, because that stuff is a crime and a huge tragedy, and it probably went on for centuries. I bet you the Catholic Church was doing that stuff for centuries, man, and only just got exposed recently. And
but we can say that it's a part of the worship, though. I mean, for me, Ed, I feel like there's this occult worship that we aren't privy to as in mainstream.
Behind closed doors, right?
And they believe there's some type of not only divinity but power in the union between a man and a young male. But I don't want to go too far off into that. But it does relate to Mother Goddess at the end of the day, correct?
Absolutely. And this is one thing that I was surprised to learn about when I first started learning about this stuff, is how consistent of a tradition these trans people were, these trans priests were all across, and they've got all these great names. In Sumer, they were the Gala, and the word Ga, I think I'm getting this right. Ga means penis and La means anus. And they were the Gala. And then in the Scythians, who were the nomadic horse riders that were the Amazon warrior women, they have the Inari were their hermaphrodite priests. In the Bible, it's the Kadesha are the women and the Kadesh are the men, and that means the holy ones. In Rome, they were the Galli priests of the goddess Cybele. And there's a lot of literature on the Galli. There's all this great, because we have the Roman literature. There's this great poem. I can't think of the guy's name right now, but about talking about this guy getting castrated and castrating himself, or like getting, it's this big drunken, there's this big drunken festival, and then in the heat of the moment, they get castrated in this sort of like ecstatic inebriation. And then, and then they wake up in the morning and be like, what have I done? I guess I'm a devotee now. And these were very dramatic rituals, and the Cybele religion in Rome was very like hardcore. There was all this spilling of blood of animals and bathing in blood and sex and like craziness, man. I don't really know that much about it, but everything I've heard is just like, holy cow, it's really
right. There is a ritual that's from Roman times where the male and female would be completely drenched in a slaughtered. There's a device, or the way the cow was lifted,
be above their heads with a grate.
Their head. And what's interesting? You look at Kobe beef and how they say they keep them off the ground, and it's so delicious and pure, and it's the highest form of meat. Well, there's this new Wagyu, but Kobe beef, Japanese style beef, the cow doesn't touch the ground. And that's similar to that time when it was above the head, and then they would bathe like a shower of blood. And they'd sit in that for days. They wouldn't, when I say sit in it, they wouldn't wash it off. It's very interesting. As I said, I'm a bit, I'm very interested in blood sacrifice, and the research is fascinating, how people used blood. So yes, that's interesting. Isn't that a scene in Caligula? I keep going. Yeah, see, I'm laughing. It's not really something funny, but I get it. Like, it's just but you know what? We still have these rituals that are occult. They still are present in not, I'm not just talking about what people consider neo-paganism. I'm talking about Abrahamic religion. So, that you see the cardinals wearing the red garb, and that's a symbol of the being drenched in the blood as well. But anyway, I don't want to go too far off, but I just wanted to throw that in. You're very interesting to talk to, so you sparked my mind on that.
Like I mean, I don't know if you got any other questions. I'm like let's see. Basically, just to come back to reiterate my basic theory, and I think that Gerda Lerner, this book I was mentioning, really she really nails it down pretty academically, is that the women had a lot more independence in the third millennium. They're losing it in the second millennium, and they lose it altogether in the first millennium. And it's not just the Hebrews and the Greeks, that the Assyrians were doing it. Even over in Asia, they were doing it. And like, there's something going on that's bigger picture, that was a broader cultural occurrence, there's a bit of an enigma and a bit of a mystery to how it all happens. But things are clearly changing right now. And to get back to the question of how it affects us today, one of the lessons I've learned for the modern woman is the notion about how our families are structured, and how our one man to one woman patriarchal marriages are the basic mechanism by which women are subordinated. And the lesson to take from that is not that we shouldn't be getting married, but that the women need to stick together. Women need to support each other more in childcare, and with building women industries, women businesses that are supportive of, that are copacetic with child rearing on a day-to-day basis, and where the women are keeping the money. And because modern day work world, a lot of women are trying to go into man-dominated workspaces that have been set up by men for men. Well, men are mobile. Men aren't worried about childcare, so they can work 10-hour days, 6-7 days a week, and because they're not worried about taking care of the children. Whereas the women have always worked. My mother always worked, but she had the kinds of jobs where the kids could be around. Like my mom had her own retail stores and she would just bring me with her. And I spent all day there with her. Or she did real estate and she'd drag me along. And so she did the kinds of businesses that were copacetic with childcare, or she worked with other women to trade babysitting duties. And I think women need to build these networks amongst themselves rather than trying to comport themselves to male workspaces, basically, where they're expected to do 10-hour days, 6 days a week. I mean, that doesn't work with childcare. And it forces women to choose one or the other, a career or motherhood. And that's no choice, man. That's not a good choice. It's not good for society. It's not good for women. And you see a lot of women just simply choosing nowadays to just not have kids.
Wow, thank you. I commend you on that. I agree with you 100%. When the women's movement, the second wave of feminism, I'm talking about in the 60s, women were fighting for rights to go to work, but really, I think what should have been is to have rights to have your children at work with you. So I completely agree with you on that.
Exactly.
Yes.
And in fact, and that's not going to be working at the Ford Motor Car Factory. It's going to be something else. It's going to be a different kind of business.
And typically women don't do jobs like that. They do clerical work. They are healthcare providers. So store owners like your mom, store owners.
In the ancient world, they ran the taverns, they ran the bars, that's the kind of thing you could have your kids back there. But and men do the dangerous work, that requires not just more strength, but more physical, like women sacrifice. There's another theory I have. Women sacrifice their bodies for for pregnancy and lactation. And that's women sacrifice themselves that way. Men sacrifice their bodies as soldiers and on construction sites and doing dangerous work, like building a radio tower or building a skyscraper or doing iron work. That's men's work. It's dangerous work.
Can I do the devil's advocate for the people out there who are going to come for you, and you can defend yourself right now?
Sure.
How dare you say that we can't do be firefighters and soldiers? And I
think
know a
women
lot of
can be
women
soldiers.
do.
Actually, women can be soldiers.
This is what will be said. I agree with you. But for the feminists, the very radical feminists who, even though you make a lot of sense, well, how do you answer that when they say, well, women do this? But before you do, I do want to let people know that standards of being a soldier are being reduced. The weight that's being carried is being reduced so women can participate in such jobs. But I want you to answer for those.
I actually have a whole theory on this. I'm glad you brought this up, because I'm a big believer that there is definitely a category of women that are more than capable of being soldiers. You look at all the women doing professional sports, the WNBA. You telling me those girls they might not be as strong as the strongest man, but they're certainly stronger than the average man. And they can certainly fight against average guys. And there are cultures in history that had women warriors. I was mentioning the Scythians. They were nomadic horse riders. So a woman on horseback with a bow and arrow was every bit as dangerous as a man and every bit as capable in battle. And so and these were the Amazons of Greek legends, because they were fought against the Greeks a lot. They show up in the Bible too. And what happens in that culture is that the girls would be trained to ride and hunt and fight and use a bow and arrow from a young age. And then when they got to be the child rearing age, they would be given a choice to whether they wanted to hang back, because they dragged all their stuff around with wagons. So do you want to hang back with the wagons with the food and the babies, or do you want to keep on fighting? And so the adult women were given this choice, and some of the women and plenty of the women would choose to keep fighting. And so they've got lots of burials, lots and lots of Scythian graves have been found all around, because they ranged from Siberia all the way down to the Black Sea, a huge range of territory for thousands of years. And so we have got lots and lots of archaeological evidence. And they found something like 20% of the burials are of women warriors, women being buried with weapons and with war wounds and with, killed in battle. And it's like 20%. And that is probably the kind of the rough number. I think 10 or 20% of women would be totally capable of, if they're not saddled down with little kids, they'd be totally capable of fighting along average men, because your average guy is not, I'm not as strong as the strongest man either. And so you put me up against, I'm just an average guy. You put me up against a tough woman athlete, and she's probably going to kick my ass, like, so I'm totally on board with women doing what they're capable of doing. And not
And
every
I
woman needs to
appreciate
be a
your
monarch.
confidence in yourself, your male confidence, and you can admit that Brittany Griner can take you out if she needed
Brittany
to.
Griner would most definitely kick my ass.
Thank you so much for all of this information. Just like last time, this is so enlightening, compelling, controversial. But if you all out there go do your research, and you can fact check Ed's work, and also get his book. Look at the book that he offered talk to me about the author again. Hold the book up with
So this is the Gerda Lerner's book. It's
Gerda
a
Lerner.
classic. It's a classic of feminist history, called The Creation of Patriarchy. I highly recommend it.
Coconut just dropped in my head. I know who she is. I've listened to many of her lectures, and I didn't know that she passed away. But she goes.
I might be wrong. Don't correct. Don't hate me if I'm wrong on that. I think.
No. It's okay. It would be a good thing if she didn't. But
yeah, she's not that long ago.
She does go into a lot of archaeology. She's done some research where she's seen where there is so much. I remember the lecture. She was showing a figurine, showing that it was all feminine gods, all female gods. And yes, I'm glad before you got off that I remembered her. Yes, definitely. I have to get the book. I've looked at her lectures, but I didn't know about her book. And I did that because I was researching Eve as the first god. And so that's a different topic, but no, not really. Not really.
I've got a whole topic on Adam and Eve, and telling Eve to submit to Adam. That story is not that old, the grand scheme of things. It's 5th, 6th century BC, somewhere around there. Nobody really knows precisely the date it was written, but it's not like it's thousands of years old. Well, it's not tens of thousands of years old. Yeah. They're telling Eve, you must submit to Adam. Well, it's because not all the women had been submitting. They're writing. I mean, these stories are all written for a contemporary audience back then. They're not writing these stories for us thousands of years in the future. They're writing the stories for contemporary audiences of their day. And so they're trying to hammer home this message in their day that women need to submit to men because they hadn't been submitting to men.
Right. Okay. There. Well, that's great. We covered that much, and definitely I agree with you. Thank you so much, Edward Dodge. And I will really quickly, before we close out, I just want to say again, A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. It is available on Amazon, and maybe later post production, Esoteric can put some links or something for your other social media. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please sit with you.
Thank you, Esoteric. Thank you, Esoteric. It's been great. I really appreciate it.